So I'm going to start off today with Russel Smith from KPMG. He leads our department on renewable energy, and they have a strong track record both in Ireland and the UK in dealing with these projects. So I'll just start off with Russell if he's there. Yeah. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So I lead the renewable energy team within KPMG Ireland, and the majority of our time is spent raising funding for renewable energy projects. We work across all the sectors, so wind, solar, etc. But over the last 5 years, we've had a core focus on raising funding for biomass projects. And it's in this topic I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes chatting through with you and giving you hopefully some insight into some successful and understand the challenges that have been faced. The majority of this is going to come from a Northern Ireland perspective, because Northern Ireland has had the benefit of a bit of a head start maybe on the ROI market. We've had quite a successful programme of support into various renewables, and hopefully it'll be a bit of a learning opportunity to see how it's been done up there. Fundraising for biomass projects is very challenging. And talking you through that, I'm going to have a few slides which will maybe help demonstrate why this is so challenging. So I'm going to look first at the macro level and the macro funding environment, and then I'm going to fall down to some real case studies and some examples, and hopefully by working through those real projects, it'll tease out some of the key issues that are affecting it. First slide here is a look at the global investment environment for renewables across all the sectors. And it's actually a very positive graph and positive trends. 2015, which is the last year we have full accurate data, was a record year, $286 billion invested across renewables globally. So clearly that's a very positive trend. However, if you look at it from a European context, you've actually got a very different graph. You can actually see that it peaked in 2011 and it's down dramatically, more than half, down to $48 billion. So what that's telling us clearly that there's an increased and growing appetite for investment globally, but Europe is not necessarily getting that. So the question is, so where is it going? The next slide is a publication that comes out annually that looks at the relative attractiveness of various countries for destination for renewable energy investment. And what's striking, you maybe won't be able to pick out the names from the page there, but the top 5, there's only one European country. And you can see at the front of the queue is the United States, you've got China, you have India, and that's actually where a lot of the funding is going. The developing nations are attracting a lot of the new renewable energy investment, and if we come closer to home and actually look at Ireland, you have to go all the way down to number 30 to find where Ireland ranks in the pecking order, so behind Taiwan and Peru. So what this is telling us is that there's a lot of investment out there, but there's a lot of competition for that investment, and Ireland isn't necessarily front of the queue. If we then go into biomass and more specifically, this graph is also quite striking, I believe. You can see that over 95% of that 278 billion is actually going into 2 sources, solar and wind. Solar and wind have been the big success story to date globally for renewable energy investment, mainly because they're seen as safe, low risk, easy to deploy, and have been supported by successive governments. The biomass piece, which I've highlighted in sort of purpley pink, is the slice of the pie really that this conference is focused on and interested in, and it's less than 2% of all global energy, renewable energy investment is focused on that. So again, you can see my statement saying fundraising for biofuels or biomass is not easy, and that's part of the reason why. If we then delve into that 2% even further, I'm afraid there's actually worse news to come. Investment into the biomass piece continues to drop year on year, and actually 2015 is the lowest level of investment in biomass sector in the last 10 years. So again, slightly surprising, and in fact I was slightly surprised by some of these stats because you know, it's quite a marked challenge we have ahead of us. That's a fairly negative story. It does get better. The next slide, before I go off the macro environment, though, I just want to look at market return expectations, because this is where it starts getting interesting. The return that an investor seeks is measured in this by a thing called internal rate of return, IRR. Basically, this is saying if you invest £1 million of equity into a project, you want a 10% IRR, means you get a 10% return on that £1 million year on, year out. The return that people expect from technologies is driven by a number of things, but the main one is the risk profile of the technology, and the risk profile of the technology depends and changes that return. So at the lower end of the scale globally is solar, and generally we're seeing solar on an all equity basis, so without any debt coming in, is looking a return of around 6 to 7, but there is variance around that. The next lowest risk is onshore wind, which is attracting returns of just below 8, just maybe a bit over. You can then see a big jump, and this is where biomass has opportunity and challenge. Biomass is still seen as an unproven, higher risk technology, and it is attracting a premium. Basically, investors are saying, if we can get an 8% return in wind, why would we invest in a biomass project which has all the additional complexities if we can't get a premium? So biomass is generally requiring a return of around the 10 or north of that. AD then, again, which has been referenced quite a number of times during the conference, is higher again. AD is, again, while there's 7,000 installations in Germany, still try to get a local banker to consider it a proven technology is a challenge, and investors are generally, again, requiring a premium. What that means is that if a support regime comes in, such as the RHI, and the RHI provides a level of support that only allows you to generate an IRR in that project of 9%, it's going to be very hard to fund that on a scalable basis in a competitive global funding environment. And so that's something we have to be careful when the rates are set. We found that example in the Irish biomass market. So Refit 3 came out, and it had tariffs to support the development of biomass projects. And from the personal scars of being involved in the Refit 3 projects, getting them to north of a 10% IRR is a real challenge, and that is why today not a single one of those is currently being built. So that's a message when we're setting tariffs. There's no point bringing out a level of support if it isn't going to be able to be a competitive project in the market. The one thing I'd say, if I showed you this graph from 3 years ago, each one of those has moved down. Globally, there is 278 billion chasing projects, so in general there is a trend downwards in the returns due to just normal economics of supply and demand. And biomass, certainly when I started maybe 4 or 5 years ago in the sector, was at least 12, 13. It's now down to 10, 11, so that is a positive. Now what it means is that there are funds who are saying 6% return isn't enough for us, and so that's why you have people who are dedicated and looking at biomass, because it does allow them to achieve a better return. Okay, so look, that's the macro piece. The macro piece, challenging. The good news is that biomass projects are still happening, and the Northern Ireland example, which I'm going to chat on now, is one of those. In the last 2.5 years, KPMG has raised £300 million of equity into biomass projects, including virgin wood biomass, waste wood biomass, large-scale anaerobic digestion, small-scale anaerobic digestion. And so if you're able to meet the return requirements, if you're able to structure the projects right, there is still plenty of capital looking for a good home. The first example I'm going to talk about is small-scale biomass assets, and this hopefully will be relevant in that this could be similar to how the RHI market develops, a large number of smaller projects as opposed to one big large one. Anaerobic digestion, hopefully people are largely familiar with it. It converts organic materials such as grass, silage and slurries, food waste, into a biogas, which then is used to generate electrical output and heat. The projects I'm talking about are all 0.5 megawatts, so half a megawatt plants. That's about 10,000 tonnes of silage. Each one's about £2.5 million, and we're talking about proven technology yet unfamiliar in Ireland. The Northern Ireland government introduced support for AD in about 2011. 2 years later, there was only a handful of projects had been built though. And that's when I got involved and our team started looking at it, and we had farmers came in and we met with the farmers and asked them why is there so little development? And the answer was fairly common. So they'd gone out, they got planning permission, they got a grid connection, and then they needed funding. And they went to the local bank and they said to the bank, can I have £2 million please to build this biomass AD plant which will help diversify my farm? And they always got the same answer. Absolutely, that is fine. Give me £3 million of unsecured land, prove you can pay it back even if the AD plant doesn't work, and consider it yours. So that resulted in a couple of projects getting over the line. And so there's a couple of projects built with bank debt secured on the farm. But in reality, you're never going to get a large uptake and rollout if you're relying on that type of funding. For the AD and for RHI and for others similar to be successful, you have to have a more flexible source of capital. And it was this then that KPMG, we thought we'd get involved and see what we could do. When we asked the farmers what they wanted, again, they came back with fairly common responses. One, they wanted someone to give them 100% of the money. Two, it had to be completely unsecured on them, no recourse to them personally. And three, they wanted to own the project outright very soon. A reasonably tall ask. What they were looking for, though, was project finance, although most of them didn't call it project finance. Project finance is a sort of funding that secures itself solely on the cash flows of the asset. So it requires a lender to come along and say, I'm comfortable to lend against this asset because I'm comfortable that it will work and generate the returns. The big problem was one of scale. So project finance is eminently doable. There's project finance all over the place. The problem is typically project finance requires an asset lend of at least 20 million because the amount of effort goes in of due diligence and getting comfortable in technology means that a bank has no real interest of just lending a couple of million. But we thought it had the characteristics of project finance. It had proven technology, it had long-term government support, it had PPAs that were going to underpin the revenues, and it had a long-term source of feedstock coming from the grass silage in the farms. So we thought if we could try and address the scale issue, maybe we could do this. So what we did is we went along to four to six farmers originally and said, look guys, individually you're never going to be able to secure project finance, but if you come together and if we standardise you that you look more like a homogenous group, we can maybe get something interesting. So we got them together and we said, you're going to have to use the same technology, you're going to have to use the same feedstock agreement, you're going to have to use the same lease, you're going to have to use the same PPA. And we got them together, we chose a technology, a company called Williams Industrial Services, that happened to be a Northern Ireland AD supplier, and we went to the market and we said, look, we've got not a £2 million project finance opportunity, we've got a £30 million opportunity and plus. And we went to the market and we got interest. And we found funders that were willing to take a bit of pain at the front to get this pipeline. And so the very first project, we started on one, and it took us 9 months to develop it from scratch and reach financial close. The second one, which we did about 3 weeks later, we did in 6 weeks because everything was cookie cuttered. And since then, we've been able to roll out then a full platform. So that was the very first project that closed in Cookstown in Northern Ireland, about £2.5 million asset. So 9 months of work to get that, the next one, 6 weeks. We now have a number of these very similar plants dotted across Northern Ireland, all funded using the same funder, the same contracts and everything. Now where it gets interesting is the other lesson is, one is scale. The second lesson of biomass funding is that the risk profile of biomass is not consistent during its lifetime. So a wind farm or a solar farm, the risk profile is pretty consistent. Like a solar farm, you can get them built and installed in 3 weeks, and there's not much can go wrong. Biomass, you've got 12-month construction as a minimum. You've got startup risk, you've got feedstock risk, biological risk. And the problem, the farmers, when they came to us and they needed the money, all of them could find one or two of those components. The three asks of 100% of the money unsecured, they could always find someone who could meet one or two of those requirements. So they could find someone who said, I'll give you 100% of the money, but I own the project. Or I'll give you 100% of the money, you can own the project, but it's at 15% and it has to stay in for 15 years. And that doesn't work. The trick here, and this is what we have funded, the structure we adopted was you have to match the funding to the risk profile of the phase of the project. And so what we did is we brought in funders for the construction phase and the early operation phase who got a very good return, but we have a full option to buy them out and refinance them out as soon as the plant is operational and stabilised. And so what we kicked off about 2 months ago was the very first refinance of the very first project, the one on the screen at the moment. And what we've been able to do is get Northern Ireland local senior debt banks interested and at the table for the first time. We've now got credit approval and we're currently going through the contracts. And what we're going to do is get 70% non-recourse senior debt into a small-scale AD plant. And what happens is we're going to get an IRR, or sorry, the cost of capital, which on day one is maybe 12-13%. We're going to end up with 1 year of operation, these farmers 100% owning their plant with a weighted cost of capital of about 6%. And that's ended up then with the optimum funding structure and their ownership. And we can just replicate that out and roll it out. And the senior debt lender refinances one, gets comfortable in the contracts, and he can refinance the pipeline very quickly. So that's been one example of the funding structure that's been adopted to address the small scale issue and the lack of security that individuals may have to bring to the table. The second case study then I'm just going to touch on, keep me right in time actually, I'm running over. The second one then is large scale biomass assets. So we're talking about small scale there. The large scale assets then, the example I'm going to use here is a project known as Bombardier. So just to give you a flavour of the type of biomass projects that have been closed, these are all ones that we've closed in the last couple of years. One would be the Evermore project, which was an 80 million fundraise for a 15 megawatt biomass plant in Derry. There was Glenmore, which is a 4 megawatt AD plant, maybe a 20 million pound asset up in Donegal, with Ballymena, 3 million. So there's some very large biomass assets being funded, and most of these are either operational or under construction now. The one I'm going to focus on though is Bombardier, because that's an interesting piece about it. Bombardier Energy from Waste is a 15 megawatt. It consumes about 160,000 tonnes of RDF, which is about 250,000 tonnes of household waste from the black bin. Reached financial close about 12 months ago, and what's interesting about it is that originally we considered a classic debt and equity model. So we looked to bring in 60-70% senior debt, we just looked to bring in 30% equity. However, it came pretty clear that the technology risk, this was gasification, so not just a normal incinerator, this was gasification, considered slightly more complex technology, and also subsidy deadline meant that we were not going to get the optimum gearing level. And we took the decision that rather than enter into a contract on day one that was going to be suboptimal, we could have ended up maybe with 50% senior debt in this project. We decided let's go all equity. And the equity markets, as I said, equity is being driven to countries that are most attractive. But if you have a good project, it's still easy enough to attract good quality equity. In this instance, we did a 110 million funding with 100% equity, the largest equity fundraise ever completed in Northern Ireland. And that's an interesting model, and it comes with a few benefits. Now, the funders that came into this one was Equitix, one was P3P, which is effectively a pension fund from England, and the Green Investment Bank. And the benefit you get from the all equity model, you're building an asset that is 2 years in construction, that there's construction risk, and if something goes wrong during that construction, if you have a senior debt lender sitting there, you've very little flexibility, and there's a high profile one, the Mayo project, which you may have been familiar with. Again, having it all equity means that you as the equity promoter are completely in control of your own destiny. You lose a bit of your return by not bringing debt leverage in early, but you get the benefit, you get a flexibility. And so this model, very similar to the AD, is we build it 100% equity, get it operational, get it proven for 12 months, and then at that time you do a one-time only refinance, bring in senior debt, get it in at 70-75%, and you end up with the optimum profile very quickly in the life cycle. And when you've brought in debt on day one, quite often it's very hard to refinance again because you've fixed your rates and you've swaps. So this is a model that we're increasingly seeing across the biomass sector, and the banks probably are not optimally placed to put cheap debt into these and take the construction risk. So there's no point fighting against it. There's enough equity to build them out and then bring in the bank when it's the right time. Okay, so look, just conclusions. Biomass funding remains challenging, but is achievable. Northern Ireland's demonstrated that. Securing non-recourse project finance, however, requires a very robust approach to contracting. Garrett, who's following me after this from Arthur Cox, is going to be talking about that structuring to achieve this funding. He's going to talk about the approach that's required. And then finally, you don't need to create the optimum funding structure on day one. The most important thing is getting these things built quickly and flexibly, and then matching and refinancing to match the funding life cycle at the right time. Thank you.